On a quiet, warm evening, Ryan Stokes found himself wandering the almost empty streets of his small suburban neighborhood. The soft hum of his sneakers on the sidewalk was drowned out by the energetic beats of the music blasting through his headphones. The evening was calm, the usual bustling energy of the day now replaced by a soothing stillness. It was exactly the kind of evening when the world felt like it had slowed down, and everything seemed to stand still for just a moment. Ryan wasn't in any particular hurry. He was just out for a walk to clear his head after another mundane day at work. The day had been filled with tedious meetings, a long commute, and the monotony of everyday life. As he walked, he absent-mindedly scrolled through his phone's news feed, trying to keep himself occupied and distracted from his own thoughts. Funny photos from friends and acquaintances, memes, random videos, everything seemed harmless, adding to his positive mood. He was enjoying the sense of normalcy, of being in control of his evening. But that moment of peace was about to be shattered. It started with a strange buzz, a notification alert. Ryan looked down at his phone to see a message pop up from an unknown Facebook user. His thumb hovered over the screen, unsure whether to open it. He didn't recognize the sender's name, and yet, something about the notification made him hesitate, a small unease creeping into his mind. Curiosity won out, and he tapped on the message. Instead of a text, there was an image. Ryan frowned as the photo loaded. It wasn't just any picture. It was of him, taken from behind, the moment he had just passed. The picture had been taken moments ago, from a vantage point just ahead of him on the street, but with a clear view of his back. The street was dark, and there was no one around. How could someone have taken this photo? A cold shiver ran down Ryan's spine. The image was so clear. He could see the dark outline of his hoodie, the faint reflection of his phone screen in his hand. The photo was eerily well-timed, as though the person had known exactly when to take it. He glanced up from the screen and looked around nervously. The street stretched out before him, empty and silent, as it had been for the past few minutes. No one was in sight. His fingers trembled as he typed a response. Who is this? He waited. The seconds ticked by, but there was no reply. Ryan took a few steps forward, still staring at the photo on his phone. He was starting to feel sick to his stomach, a tight knot of anxiety forming in his chest. The stillness of the night began to feel heavier, suffocating, as though the air itself was thick with something he couldn't name. Another message. Another photo. This one was even more unsettling. It was a close-up shot of the back of his head, taken from the street corner just ahead of him. The angle was impossible. No one could have been standing there without him seeing them. And yet, there it was. The same hoodie, the same posture, the same phone in his hand. He felt his heart race in his chest. The images were not only showing where he had been, but they seemed to track his every step. He was being watched, and the realization hit him like a thunderclap. Whoever was sending these pictures was right behind him. With a growing sense of panic, Ryan picked up his pace. His feet moved faster, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Every step he took felt heavier, the ground beneath him colder, as though something was pulling at him from the darkness ahead. He could hear his breath, ragged and quick, and the music in his headphones began to fade into an oppressive silence. Another buzz. Another photo. This one was different. It wasn't a picture of him anymore. It was a picture of the street, taken from a window across the road, and in the corner of the image, he could just make out a shadow, dark and tall, standing at the edge of the sidewalk, hidden in the dim light of the street lamp. The shadow was unmistakable. It was human-shaped, but the figure was somehow indistinct, blending into the night. Ryan felt his throat tighten as he realized the figure was staring directly at him. His heart hammered against his ribs as he spun around, his eyes searching the street behind him. But the street was as empty as it had been a moment ago. Nothing. No one. Just the eerie, oppressive silence of the night. Yet, despite the emptiness, Ryan knew in his gut that someone was out there. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Desperate now, Ryan turned off his music, his headphones dangling around his neck. He quickened his steps again, almost running, as his mind raced for some rational explanation. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone had hacked into his account. Maybe it was just some sick joke. He glanced at his phone again, but the next message made his blood run cold. The message contained no photo this time, only text, "Don't run. I'm right behind you." Ryan's breath caught in his throat. His mind went blank, the panic rising like a tidal wave. He turned once more, looking over his shoulder, his pulse pounding in his ears, but there was nothing. No shadow, no movement. Just the dim streetlights and the distant sound of his rapid breathing. Was he losing his mind? Or was someone truly following him? A sudden, loud noise shattered the stillness. A crackling sound, like footsteps on gravel, echoed from behind him. Ryan froze. The sound was unmistakable, a crunch of footsteps too close, too deliberate. He spun around, his eyes wide in terror. And there, standing at the far end of the street, bathed in the harsh glow of a single street lamp, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it seemed to be, but there was something wrong with him. His face was obscured by shadows, his body unnaturally still, as though he were waiting for something, waiting for Ryan. The figure was tall and thin, and the posture was unnerving. The man was standing perfectly still, as though frozen, but Ryan could sense that he was being watched, that he was being studied. Ryan's legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to take a step back, then another. His hand trembled as he grabbed for his phone again, his thumb pressing frantically on the screen, trying to compose another message, something to send, something to escape. But there was nothing. The message field was blank, the keyboard unresponsive. Another photo. This time, the photo was not of Ryan. It was of the figure, taken from right behind him. Ryan's stomach churned. He slowly turned around, eyes wide with terror, to find the street completely empty once again. The figure was gone. Or had it ever been there at all? The sound of the buzzing phone cut through the silence. Another message. Ryan's fingers barely managed to open it, his mind numb with fear. "You can't run forever, Ryan. I know where you are." The words blurred on the screen. In that moment, Ryan's phone slipped from his hand, falling to the ground with a dull thud. He was paralyzed by fear, unable to think, unable to move. Everything had become a blur, a fever dream of confusion, anxiety, and dread. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, "I'm right behind you." Ryan turned slowly, his body moving as though through molasses. And there, standing a mere foot away, was the man. The last thing Ryan saw before everything went black was the figure's face, pale, twisted, and smiling. Ryan Stokes blinked in shock, his mind struggling to process the reality of the moment. The figure standing before him was like something out of a nightmare. A tall, unnaturally thin man with hollow eyes and an unsettling grin. His skin was so pale it seemed almost translucent, like he hadn't seen the sun in years. His smile twisted unnervingly, as if he knew something Ryan didn't. But what truly froze Ryan in place were his eyes. Deep, black voids that seemed to swallow any trace of light. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world around Ryan seemed to tilt, warping into something sinister. The faint hum of the distant streetlights, the rustling of leaves in the wind, everything became muffled. The only sound Ryan could hear was the rush of blood pounding in his ears. He couldn't look away from the figure. His instinct screamed at him to run, to scream, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. The man tilted his head slightly, almost as if he were examining Ryan, measuring him. And then, in a voice that sent an icy shiver down Ryan's spine, the man spoke. "Why did you stop walking, Ryan? You were doing so well." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they were laced with a chilling undertone. The man took a slow step forward, his presence heavy in the air. Ryan instinctively took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. But his feet felt like lead, and he stumbled, his legs betraying him. I don't know you," Ryan stammered, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes darted around, searching for some kind of escape. Who are you?" The figure's smile widened. "You really don't recognize me? I'm disappointed, Ryan. We've met before. Haven't you heard of me?" Ryan's confusion deepened. His mind raced, trying to think back, but nothing made sense. His heart pounded louder, and he suddenly realized that the streetlights, the familiar quiet of his neighborhood, had taken on an entirely different atmosphere. The once comforting surroundings now seemed alien, ominous, as though the very street was shifting, folding in on itself. "I've been watching you for a while now," the man continued. "Every step, every turn, every moment. You thought you were alone, but you were never alone, Ryan." His grin deepened, the darkness in his eyes growing stronger. Ryan took a shaky breath, trying to keep his composure. He forced himself to speak. "What do you want from me? What do you mean? You've been watching me." The figure's voice lowered, growing almost intimate. "What I want is simple. I want you to understand what's happening. All of it. This game you're playing, Ryan. It's been going on for far longer than you realize." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Ryan's face. "You've been walking down this street for a reason, and you've been in my sights for a reason, too." Ryan's legs felt weak, and he took another cautious step back. He couldn't make sense of the man's words, but the fear crawling up his spine told him it wasn't a joke. The earlier photos, the strange messages, there was a connection. It was all happening for a purpose, and he was at the center of it. "Please," Ryan gasped, his voice shaky. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand. Who are you? Why me?" The figure tilted his head again, his grin never faltering. "Why you?" he mused, as if considering the question carefully. "Oh, Ryan, you're special. You've always been special." He took another step forward. "You've just never noticed before." Ryan's breath hitched. The man's words seemed to drip with malice, but there was an undertone of something else, something familiar, that made Ryan's stomach churn. The feeling was growing stronger. Something in his past was coming back to him, something from years ago that he had buried deep down. A childhood memory flickered in his mind, the face of a stranger in the distance, an incident he had long since tried to forget. Suddenly, it hit him. The face in the shadow, the eyes staring at him from the corner of his memory. It was the same man, the same figure. Ryan's throat constricted, a cold sweat forming on his brow. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body felt like it was frozen in place. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure continued, his voice now a low whisper. "You don't remember, do you? How could you? You've been living a lie, Ryan. But I'm here to remind you." Ryan's heart raced as the man took another slow step forward, his eyes locking onto his. "What do you want from me?" Ryan finally managed to whisper. "I want you to face the truth," the figure replied, his voice dark, almost too calm. "I want you to remember. I want you to remember all of it." And just as Ryan was about to ask him what he meant, a loud buzzing sound filled the air. Ryan's phone, which had fallen to the ground when he dropped it earlier, buzzed again. His mind momentarily snapped away from the figure as the phone's screen lit up. Another message. The text was simple, yet it made his blood run cold. "Look behind you, Ryan." Before he could react, the street behind him shifted. The familiar houses and quiet sidewalks seemed to warp, like the world itself was twisting and bending in unnatural ways. For a split second, Ryan thought he saw faces, people staring at him from the windows, their eyes empty and hollow. The street seemed to stretch on endlessly, far beyond what he could see. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, Ryan noticed a movement. A figure. It was standing at the far end of the street, staring at him. But this time, it wasn't the man in front of him. It was something else, something more sinister, a darker version of the street itself. Before Ryan could even comprehend what he was seeing, the figure in front of him spoke again, his voice a mere whisper. "Don't turn around." Ryan couldn't help himself. The words from the message had planted a seed of dread so deep inside him that it took every ounce of willpower not to look back. But something inside him, the purest form of self-preservation, made him do the one thing he had been warned not to do. He turned around. The figure at the end of the street wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving. It was walking toward him, slowly at first, and then faster. Each step growing more deliberate, more purposeful. Ryan's heart pounded as his legs finally decided to obey. He took off, running down the street, his feet pounding against the pavement. The world around him blurred, the buildings, the streetlights, everything becoming a haze of color and motion. His mind screamed at him to run faster, to escape, but his breath was shallow, his lungs burning. And then, the lights flickered. Everything went dark. Ryan stumbled, falling to the ground with a sharp gasp. The air grew cold, frigid, as if he had been plunged into an ice-cold abyss. The buzzing of his phone stopped. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one visible in the freezing air. And then silence. Ryan struggled to get up, but when he reached out, he couldn't feel the ground beneath him. He was floating, suspended in darkness, surrounded by a void. A voice echoed in the nothingness. "Did you really think you could escape me, Ryan?" The man's voice was everywhere now, and it seemed to come from all directions. It was like the world itself had become his voice. Ryan tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. Panic consumed him. He reached out, desperate to find anything, any clue to escape, but the darkness was endless. The last thing Ryan saw before the darkness swallowed him completely was the figure. That same pale, twisted man, standing in front of him with that haunting smile. "You're mine now, Ryan," the man whispered, "and you will never leave." And then, everything went silent. The darkness swallowed Ryan whole, but it was not a peaceful kind of dark. It was suffocating, oppressive, and it felt as though the very air was alive with an unbearable weight. His mind, trapped in this infinite black space, struggled to comprehend what was happening, but there was nothing to hold on to, no ground beneath him, no way to move. He tried to scream again, but his voice was swallowed by the void, the sound muffled and distant as though he was trapped in the deepest part of the ocean, miles below the surface. He couldn't even feel his body, only a cold, paralyzing sense of helplessness that made his every thought slow and thick. It was as if time itself had frozen. Or worse, it had stopped entirely. A faint flicker of light broke through the suffocating darkness. At first, it was just a tiny glimmer, like a faraway star in an endless sky, but it began to grow, expanding outward until the light engulfed Ryan completely. His body, though he still couldn't feel it, seemed to snap back into place, and his vision slowly cleared. He was no longer floating in the void. The world around him had changed again, but this time, it was worse. The light that had appeared now hung in the air like a dull, sickly glow, casting long, grotesque shadows across what seemed like an abandoned city. The buildings around him were crumbling, with windows shattered, doors hanging off their hinges. The streets were littered with debris, and an overpowering sense of decay filled the air. A dead silence pervaded everything. Ryan took a cautious step forward, unsure of what this place was, or how he had gotten here. His pulse thudded in his ears. His eyes scanned the area, but there was no sign of life. Everything felt wrong. The air itself tasted stale and thick, like mold and rot. Yet, there was something familiar about the place, something he couldn't quite place. As his eyes adjusted further, Ryan began to notice details that sent chills crawling up his spine. The cracked pavement beneath his feet was stained with something, dark, sticky, and vaguely metallic. The streetlights flickered above, their dim glow casting eerie shadows, some of them too long, too angular. It was as though the very landscape was warped, twisting reality itself into something nightmarish. Then, he heard it. A faint, low noise at first. A soft rustling, like the sound of fabric dragging across concrete. The hairs on the back of Ryan's neck stood up as he turned toward the source of the sound. It came from an alleyway between two dilapidated buildings, dark and narrow. He should have run. He should have gotten out of there. But something pulled him forward, something dark inside his chest that he couldn't ignore. The rustling grew louder as he moved closer, and then, suddenly, it stopped. Ryan froze, every muscle in his body locked in place. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes searched the shadows. There, in the dim light, he saw something. A figure. It was hunched down low, obscured in the shadows. But Ryan could make out enough to know that it was not human, at least not in the way he understood it. Its limbs were unnaturally long, twisted in impossible angles, and its body was an outline of darkness itself, shifting in a way that defied any logic. It had no face, No defining features. Just a void of blackness where its head should be, like it was a hollow shell, an absence pretending to be something alive. Ryan's heart slammed against his ribs, a primal fear washing over him. His legs, though weak and trembling, finally obeyed. He turned on his heel and bolted, running blindly through the street, the echo of his own footsteps deafening in his ears. He didn't look back, but as he sprinted, someone, was keeping pace with him. It wasn't just the figure. Ryan could hear other footsteps now. More. Closer. Whispers echoed in the air, unintelligible, like 1,000 voices murmuring at once. The voices felt familiar, like they were calling his name, each one overlapping the last. Ryan, Ryan, you can't escape. The whispers grew louder and more frantic. The footsteps behind him began to increase in number, a cacophony of heavy, dragging steps that sounded wrong, unnatural. Ryan's pulse quickened, his breath ragged, but no matter how fast he ran, the footsteps were always just behind him. A flash of movement caught his eye. He dared to glance back over his shoulder for a split second. The first figure, the tall, twisted man, was there, but he was no longer just standing in the alley. He was now standing in front of Ryan, blocking the way. The man's face remained a blur of shadows, but his smile was stretched impossibly wide, and his eyes glowed with a faint, sickly light. He opened his mouth, the grin stretching even further, and the whispers intensified. "Did you think this was over, Ryan? Did you think you could run from me?" Ryan's feet came to a screeching halt as he tried to process the words. He looked around, frantically searching for an exit, but the street had changed. The buildings seemed to stretch and close in on him, narrowing the space, trapping him in this nightmarish version of the world. The man took a slow step forward. "You've been chosen, Ryan. You have no choice now." Ryan took a shaky step back, his breathing quick and shallow. He could feel the cold, invisible hands of terror clutching at his chest, squeezing until he couldn't breathe. The man reached forward, his long, unnaturally thin fingers outstretched. "You can't run forever. There's no escape. No one can save you." Before Ryan could react, the ground beneath him shifted. The very earth seemed to give way, cracking open like a gaping wound. He screamed as he lost his footing and tumbled forward, his body falling into a deep, endless chasm that seemed to open up from nowhere. The air rushed past him, and the cold engulfed him. There was no ground, no sense of direction. It felt like falling into nothingness, an infinite abyss that threatened to swallow him whole. And as the darkness closed in around him, he saw something. At the very edge of his vision, in the fading light, he caught a glimpse of his phone. His actual phone, falling beside him, the screen cracked, still illuminated with the last message. "You were always mine." Ryan screamed, but no sound came out. He was falling through time and space, and the darkness swallowed him, its cold embrace taking him deeper and deeper into its eternal night. Ryan awoke with a sudden, violent gasp, as if someone had just yanked him from the depths of a nightmare. His eyes snapped open, heart racing, breath coming in desperate, jagged gasps. But the familiar warmth of the evening street, the soft hum of the city around him, greeted him with an unsettling sense of normalcy. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting a pale glow on the pavement beneath his feet. His phone, still in his hand, buzzed again. The screen flickered to life, showing a message notification. The text was simple, almost casual, but it froze Ryan in place. "Good night, Ryan. Sleep well." He blinked, rubbing his eyes as confusion overtook him. He hadn't fallen asleep. He hadn't dreamed. But the words, those same words that had haunted him throughout his descent into the darkness, were there again, appearing with such casual ease that they made his blood run cold. And then, as if the universe itself had conspired to reaffirm the nightmare, his eyes locked onto the reflection in the glass of a nearby storefront. It wasn't his reflection. The face staring back at him wasn't his own. The man in the glass was gaunt, hollow-eyed, with a sickly, twisted grin stretched unnaturally across his face. The face in the reflection was pale, with dark streaks under the eyes. Eyes that were not his, but those of someone else, someone terrifyingly familiar. He felt a sudden wave of dizziness, his knees buckling beneath him. "No," Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. "No, no, no. This can't be real. This isn't happening." The reflection's smile widened impossibly, the figure tilting its head to one side. And then, in that chilling, distorted voice, it spoke. "You're still here, Ryan. Still trapped. You never left." Ryan's throat closed up, panic overwhelming him. He spun around, frantically looking for any kind of escape, but the street around him was now utterly unfamiliar. The same cracked pavement, the same dilapidated buildings, the same flickering lights, but now, it felt like something else had seeped into the very fabric of the world. The streets twisted, the shadows growing longer, darker, more oppressive. He tried to run. His feet pounded against the ground, but the farther he ran, the more the street stretched out before him, a never-ending maze of broken windows and dilapidated facades. The lights flickered and went out one by one, plunging him into darkness. The sound of footsteps followed him, echoing in the distance, always just out of sight, always one step behind. His breath came in ragged gasps, but no matter how fast he ran, the footsteps grew louder, closer. The whispers returned, as they had before, growing in intensity, murmuring his name from the shadows, from every direction. "Ryan, Ryan, you're mine." A soft, cold laugh echoed in the darkness. Ryan could feel it in his chest, vibrating in the air around him. The laughter grew louder, until it became deafening, like the sound of 1,000 voices speaking over each other. He stumbled to a stop, his body shaking violently. His mind swirled with confusion and fear. He couldn't escape it. He had tried, and failed. Turning back toward the street, he saw the figure. The tall, thin man, the one with the hollow eyes and twisted grin, was standing in front of him again. The same smile that had haunted him, the same darkness behind those soulless eyes. This time, though, it wasn't just a reflection. This time, it was real. "You were never meant to leave, Ryan," the man said softly, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "I told you, you're mine." Ryan backed away, his body frozen with terror, but no matter how far he stepped back, the man stayed in place. Every part of him screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The street had no end. The shadows grew longer, creeping closer. The man began to move, slowly stepping toward him with that same deliberate, methodical pace, his smile never faltering. "There's no escape, Ryan," he said again, the words slipping from his mouth like an old, broken record. "There's no way out. You were always part of this." Ryan's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The photo on his phone, the strange messages, the twisted figure that seemed to haunt him everywhere. He had thought it was some kind of sick joke, some prank, but the reality, the nightmare, was clear now. There was no escaping this. He was trapped. His phone buzzed again in his hand. A final message. This time, it wasn't just text. It was a photo. Ryan's heart stopped. The photo was of himself, standing in the very street where he stood now. But this time, there was something else. Something far worse. The photo showed him, but not alone. Behind him, in the shadows of the alleyway, was the figure, the man. And in the darkness, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, there were more shapes. Figures, hundreds of them. Their eyes glowing in the dim light, their faces just as hollow and empty as the one in the reflection. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as he realized something even more terrifying. He had always been here. He had never left. He had never escaped. The figure in front of him reached out a long, bony hand and gently touched his shoulder. The contact was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt. His body stiffened as he felt a chill spread through him, a sensation of drowning, of being submerged in something thick and suffocating. He turned his head slightly, barely able to move, and saw the man's face just inches from his own, that wide, twisted grin mere inches from his ear. "Welcome back, Ryan," the man whispered, his breath hot and foul against his skin. "This is your home now. There's no going back." And then, as if the world itself had cracked open, everything went black. Ryan was never heard from again. His disappearance, like so many others, became just another forgotten mystery in a city full of secrets. But those who knew him, those who looked at his last posts, his last photos, could never shake the feeling that he hadn't just vanished. Some say they still hear his voice in the whispers of the night. They say his eyes are still out there, following them, watching through the shadows. And in the eerie glow of a phone screen, sometimes, just sometimes, you might see a new message from an unknown sender. And the last line, always the same. "You're mine now."